Anyways, back by popular demand, I have my guest David Goa here again, and with his dog Scraps. And today we'll be talking about the zombie apocalypse and how it's almost an archetype in this day and age. David Goa, good to have you back on our show again.
Nice to see you.
Yep.
You've been interested in this theme of the zombies for some time.
Yes.
Where does your interest come from?
And I realized the interesting thing with the zombie apocalypse, it has its only genre, like it hit the very depths of stupid humor, but the very peak of intellectual debate. Like maybe Max Brooks books and some of the Walking Dead series, they're very intellectual. They're very deep. You know, it's human survival. It's humans surviving in a post-apocalyptic world. It's getting along with other individuals. It's surviving in a harsh environment. So it has a survival theme.
Well, you know, you've paid attention to this in popular culture, and I have not.
No.
But I'm always interested in the way in which a theme, or a kind of archetype, as you called it here, where that exists in the ancient world, or in archaic societies, or in the great religions of the world, how it exists in these other times and places, and then how curious it is that it gets pulled forward into our time. It leaps technologies and what have you. So let's just think a little bit about what this kind of type was and still is in some cultures and some religious communities. There is the zombie, and indeed the use of the word, you know, it's an African word actually.
Really?
And I think it comes from Zaire, the old Congo. There was some argument about this being a religious form that was brought from Africa, but there's been lots of debate about that. And I'm not terribly interested in that debate, but we find it within the people in Jamaica and Haiti as well. In one of the kind of cults, and I use the word in its best and most ancient sense, that is, what do we cultivate together?
Okay.
That's really what cult means. That which you cultivate, in a sense, that which you adore, that which you worship. So there are many of these different kinds of communities of ritual and of particular cult that exists in Jamaica and Haiti and other places, parts of Africa. In one example that I can use to illustrate this, several registers of zombies.
Okay.
One register is the sky gods. They're understood to be part of this phenomena. Another is the earth gods, the earthbound deities. But the one that I find most interesting is the zombies associated with family.
Really?
And family ancestors.
Okay.
And this is quite highly developed in a number of these ritual traditions. And what happens there is, actually in all of these registers, but in the most interesting way in this family one, is that at particular times in the life of a community, whether it's the burial, or it can be at other times too, weddings, the naming ceremonies of babies and what have you, particular people will become possessed.
Okay.
They will enter a kind of ecstatic state. They will be, as we would say in the history of religions, they would be taken over by the zombie spirit of the ancestor. Or taken over by the zombie spirit of the deity. And that usually is brought on through drumming and dancing, and this possession is really what interests me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is this possession really about? What's going on here? What's the meaning of it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in other circumstances, in other cultures, other forms of this kind of cult, the zombie spirit will be understood to be the spirit of somebody whose life has been deeply, deeply unsatisfying.
Oh.
A person who has taken their own life, for example, or somebody who's been executed as a criminal. That their ghost will take over a person.
Okay.
And the person will be possessed and will behave in very particular kinds of ways as a result of that. So there's a third one that strikes me, and we find this, some scholars have written about it in Haiti, where if a person behaves really badly within that tight society, we're looking really at tight village societies, tight tribal and clan societies. If somebody becomes exceedingly selfish, that is, breaks the norm of we're all in this together, collectivity means everything.
Yep.
If in fact they step outside of that
Yep.
and begin to possess everything for themselves,
The North American ethos.
well, it's a very common notion of, hyper-individualism
Yeah.
and selfishness, expressing itself through selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
There is some suggestion that the community together recognizes this and proceeds to, some would say proceeds to curse them.
Okay.
But what does that mean? It's a kind of metaphor for, okay, you want to be by yourself? You want to just be selfish? All right. We will completely deprive you of all our goodwill, completely deprive you of all our relationship. And in those circumstances, there's studies that have been done on this. Those people they really become sort of clinically insane.
Yep.
And often die because of the level of alienation and isolation. But for a period of time, they wander.
Okay.
Another name for zombie, I suppose, is wandering spirit.
Okay.
Or the living dead. There's all this images of a zombie being the body of somebody who has died, now possessed by some kind of ghost or some kind of spirit. So let's just try and unwrap those a little bit.
Okay.
Like, it's one thing to think of them as a kind of horror genre, but horror has meaning.
Yep.
And then we can think a little bit, I'd be interested in your thoughts on why this is attractive in our day. So first of all, what's the possible meaning of this?
Well, I've heard people make the analogy in our civilization, in our consumer fear-based society. It's like we consume. We're fear-driven. We're not intellectual. We don't ask the big questions anymore. So in many ways, we're acting more zombie-like to begin with.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
When
When in fact people are completely outer-directed,
yeah.
when they are living solely out of an appetite that's ripped out of their own real feelings and real self-interests, when they only identify with externals. In some sense, one could see that as a kind of demon possession, being possessed of some daemon other than your own real self. I appreciate that, and I think that's one interesting possibility. But there are a couple more as well. So let me just mention that, and then we can talk about the modern circumstance a little bit.
Right.
One of the great human struggles, it seems to me, is the struggle that occurs around death and dying.
Right.
The struggle that occurs around loss, whether it's the loss of somebody you love or the loss of an enemy, or whether it's the loss of friendship, the loss of love, all of these forms of loss which hurt deeply and which become areas of human struggle. So if we think of the cases in Jamaica where you have these cults of the family zombie, they are, it seems to me, they are at least in part a kind of language of relationship to those who have gone before us.
Okay. So these would
Now they may of course, in a kind of neurotic way, be hanging on to things that would be better let go of. But they may also be a language of relationship to those that have gone before us, which isn't unhealthy. I think of more, well, you and I both worship in the Orthodox Church. And in our church, in our tradition, we have quite a series of liturgies and rituals when it comes to death and dying and the memory of the dead. Much more than virtually any other church.
That's very true.
Both leading up to the dying, but then at the time that a person dies, and then in memory of the person who has died. And then also within the liturgical year, we do that for everybody who we know, between the Feast of Resurrection and the Feast of Ascension. We call it Parastas, or the blessing of the graves, where we remember people. So what is that? Well, I think, in part, it's an unbelievable form of psychotherapy.
Okay.
Because just because somebody dies doesn't mean they leave.
Okay.
I mean, just ask any psychiatrist, any psychologist, any counselor, any clergy person, and you will see that they spend most of their time talking with people who are in a state of suffering because somebody has died or there's been a death in their life of one form or another, and they have not been able to resolve it. So this lack of resolution is part of our spiritual struggle. So my sense is that the zombie figure in many of these archaic cultures is a ritualized form of grappling with that lack of resolution. So in a sense, the idea of the living dead is very important here. Because just because somebody has left this world doesn't mean your relationship to them is resolved. You may carry that in your mind and your heart. You may see the world through the prism of the wounds of that relationship. So in that sense, the living dead are there always within our minds and our hearts. And these ritual systems are ways of trying to perhaps bring some, if they're healthy, bring some peace and some resolution where there had been none or not enough while the person was still living. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, and actually that could be a very strong psychological construct. I mean, the zombie actually mean to some individuals the fear of death and also unresolved issues. Plus ills of society, more narcissistic society, more self-serving society, and plus our fear of our own mortality, all being combined in basically one genre.
So if we look at the modern treatment of this,
Like, if you think of the zombie, like, it is a human bent on destroying the living human. You have a small group of survivors trying to survive the hordes of the undead. I don't know, that could actually be a very rich metaphor for a very fear-based society.
Of course.
I mean,
Right, and we have lots of reasons for it in our society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all the way from a kind of apocalyptic thinking about the ecology and about the future of the earth. All of the issues of war and vengeance within our world. All of the issues of mass death, which is a kind of unique part of the modern psyche. Mass death, whether we're talking about the Holocaust or we're talking about nuclear war. All of these are, they kick around in the human mind and the human heart. They're part of our culture. And they leave people with a sense that death itself haunts us. Death itself stalks us. And
Bingo.
There's fear.
Bingo. Agreed. And that would make it a very good argument for the archetype and metaphor. I mean, it is the masses of zombies chasing the last few surviving human beings. That's very much deep into our conscious. So it could be a very much a metaphor for what's actually kind of going around us.
Around in our culture and become part of the daily diet. All you have to do is watch the news, or right at this point, for example, the television news is completely preoccupied with the horrors for our media. They spend all their time on it, and if you would listen carefully, maybe even not all that carefully, to the way they recycle the images about this and the concerns about it, and if a person fed on that in a deep way, got fascinated by it and fixated by it, which often happens when it comes to tragedy. It becomes a terrible habit. Well, you are bound to become fearful and to read what occurred there back into your own life, into your own society. In a society like ours, where the great anthropologist, the Irish anthropologist Mary Douglas, wrote a wonderful little book quite a few years ago called Purity and Danger. And I mean, what she was pointing out is that the mental landscape of the modern person is made up of these two competing concerns. Concern for purity, concern for danger. And I think in so many ways those are kicking around in our culture and become part of the daily diet.
Now you said that comes from a backtrack to our previous conversation. And what you're saying in like...
Well, I only know about this in Haiti. In Haiti, that I read a book about it some years ago, about the fact that in some village contexts, and you know, we have to remember that where there is very tight society, it's hard for us to think our way into it because our society is exactly the opposite. And so to imagine a society in which everybody knows everybody and everybody's business and all their ancestors. Those kinds of societies, the person is in a way, the person is somewhat different than in our society. You know, it's not really, I mean, all of them are persons, but there isn't anything quite like our sense of being an individual in that kind of society. So when a person becomes self-possessed, I mean in the negative sense of the word, when the person begins to manifest selfishness and finds themselves an outsider within that kind of society, then I understand sometimes that's taken on by the group.
Okay.
And they simply say, okay, so that's how you understand yourself, and that's how you understand us. Well, then you're going to live with that.
Yeah.
And it becomes a very, very thorough kind of shunning.
Okay.
I mean, we see this kind of shunning in other societies. We see
Your community.
the person's exiled.
Yeah.
Now, they may still live in the community, but they'll be a living dead person in the community.
You don't talk
Because
to
nobody will have any relationship.
You're basically a leper of
Yeah,
ancient times.
that's right. You may wander about, but you're going to have no relationship.
Mhm.
And that is, obviously, that is extremely destructive.
Just these people just take it to the next level.
Right. They have just
Yeah.
pulled it forward to its ultimate conclusion.
And there's been research that use that blowfish bearing poisons. Essentially, it's an extreme, what's it, a neurotoxin, I think the word is, or you're basically stoned or a very powerful painkiller. So you basically become zombified. Some of the research that's been done in like out to selfish individuals as a punishment.
Well, punishment is one way you could view it.
Oh,
Another way you can view it is that they're simply
recognize.
drawing to conclusions what you've done to yourself.
Oh, okay.
You know, you're going to live a selfish life? Well, then live a selfish life. You're going to live a life only out of your own interests? Well, then live a life out of your own interests.
So
If you're doing that, you're a zombie.
So they're just allowing an individual to become what they're
Right.
going to do anyways.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Now, I would also say that none of these things, of course, are pure.
Hmm.
So, we see this kind of shunning can take place for a variety of reasons.
Hmm.
I've given you only the one that's been talked about and been seen as even a kind of political action
Yeah.
over against selfishness. But it's not surprising, and it'd be a little naive not to realize that groups of people can decide that somebody is on the outside.
Yeah.
And they can do it for a variety of reasons,
Because-
including their own political self-interest.
Yeah.
And they could, in a society that's tight enough,
Mhm.
they could do it in such a way that the person becomes completely disconnected and completely estranged and ends up in a state of unbelievable isolation and eventually of death.
That would describe like just about any kind of persecuted minority in our civilization. Being socially
Well,
exiled.
you know, we exile people, we isolate them in ghettos and what have you, but, you know, many minorities have their own culture.
Yep.
And when they have their own culture, what the other culture is doing to them doesn't have the gravity that we're talking about here. You see, this can only work,
Mhm.
that kind of death-bearing isolation, that turning you into the walking dead, can only work if in fact you share the same culture
Mhm.
and have the same things that can click you off, the same relational characteristics of everybody else. But in the case of minorities within a society, minorities can often flourish even when they're persecuted or even when they're marginalized in terms of dominant institutions. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to become dysfunctional. I'm always amazed at how, if we take the example of Canada, or really of many other places, how some of the finest literature comes from people who grew up in minority cultures.
Oh yes.
In Canada, for example, you just have to think about how many fine novelists do we have that come from Mennonite communities, small Mennonite communities which were highly structured and which were pretty successful, but also were not,
Very repressive.
they were not necessarily integrated into dominant society until, parts of them certainly are now, but until somewhat later, and some of them came as refugees and what have you. But where there is a tight culture, you have great gifts. But also where there's a tight culture, you also have potential dangers.
And actually, what you said there, I just realized something. When someone changed my viewpoint a full 360 degrees, the concept in the zombie, in the zombie genre, you have hordes of zombies and a handful of small survivors. That's almost like a persecuted minority right there. So it could be an actual metaphor of what many people are going through, is that you're a small persecuted minority against the masses. So that could be just kind of an unconscious archetype.
Well, sometimes, I mean, I don't normally go to malls,
Okay.
but on the few occasions I have, I must admit, there are times I wonder, who are these people? Like, people with this extraordinary appetite to get all their identity. I mean, and I don't know, of course, but it seems to me their identity is so completely wrapped up in consumer goods.
Yes.
That it's hard to recognize them. Now, I'm sure with the vast majority of them, if you could sit down over a beer or something and have a serious conversation, if that's possible, you find another human being and another human story there.
Yep.
But the general pattern of behavior, this kind of herd behavior,
Yes.
that herd behavior is pretty common in the modern world, and there's lots of fear about it. There's compulsions around it, and there's also fear about it. There's both.
Very true. And actually, you see this as well. Our friend Archbishop Lasar talked about this. Was it last year or the year before? I think it was the year before. During the Black Fridays, and people were trampled to death during sales at a particular store, and effectively there's like this maddening herd or this maddening stampede mentality just to get a cheaper plasma TV. I mean, they're willing to storm through this major store just to get a cheaper price on something. Like it is a maddening, non-humanistic.
Well, it looks like demon possession. I mean, they're possessed of the demon commerce, you know. I mean, it's a very curious thing, but we have other examples in our society too, where there's people who are so fixated on some particular part of life or some particular goal that that they behave in pretty inhuman ways.
Something else? They go. I can think of many analogies. We have a homeless problem in the United States. But they have surplus housing at the same time. People are still homeless, but yet there's a surplus of housing.
Yeah. Well, all societies have their way of deciding who is worthy and who isn't.
Yes.
And of structuring the economy around that.
Yes.
And it's often the poor that take the burden of that upon themselves and live that out. I sometimes think, Derek, when I meet some people on the street who are homeless and spend a little time talking with them. And a number of them, of course, have pretty serious challenges in their life.
Yes.
Economic, social, psychological, spiritual challenges. But I sometimes see in these brothers and sisters that they've actually taken on, in almost an artistic way, the disease that has caused them to suffer. And in some cases, they kind of act it out
Cool.
in front of us. And
I have heard that can judge a civilization not by their greatest achievements, but by the most, how neglected is the lowest part of their society. When you
how do you treat the most vulnerable in your society?
Yes, that's how you measure society,
Yeah.
per se, of itself.
How do you treat the most vulnerable? And we, there's part of our society which has done quite good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that the kind of social safety net we have in Canada, I view it as part of our commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
This is something we do for each other. Are there problems with it, limitations? Of course there is. There's all of that. But there are sectors of our society
Mm-hmm.
which are very vulnerable and are not treated well at all, which we need to do much more around. And people that have gotten into a situation where they're living on the street and can't break whatever patterns are there. It's one thing to provide housing for them,
Yes.
but it's another thing to provide a life. And sometimes with our systems, we feed the body, but starve the soul and the spirit.
Agreed.
And part of I think our individual and our collective responsibility, certainly for churches and other groups like that, which claim to have a vocation of service,
Mm-hmm.
is to see that we don't starve the spirit and the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And that means time, more than money. It means spending time,
Yes.
walking, being with these people.
And
And the elderly in our society now, the elderly and those who are infirmed,
Mm-hmm.
and become warehoused in a variety of ways.
That's very true. Like,
This is awful.
We warehouse our elders. That's something as congregations, we don't take care of our elders very well. And it entails, the Aboriginals, they treat their elders phenomenally well. So we can learn from them. But I've also experienced hanging around some hippies at the Ledge grounds here in Edmonton, and I noticed like some of the very poor and like halfway to homeless people I've talked to, they do form very nice, very close-knit communities. And it's actually it was very interesting getting to know some of these people. They pool together,
Sure.
they have almost a semi-nomadic existence.
Right.
One individual I knew joined the circuit, so he's actually improving himself. So you kind of see that particular groups of marginalized humans come together for survival against a very hostile environment. But it's not a hostile environment of nature, but of these other human beings. Hence these zombies. So you can kind of see how that's kind of becoming an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
In other aspects. So it's pretty good to have this conversation. I was looking at it from one point of view, but now I went 360. It's like, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I went from focusing on the zombies
Mm-hmm.
to focusing on the survivors,
Mm-hmm.
and we're actually, I can kind of see how why this genre is so popular, because it's relevant to what's going on in our society. It's kind of like,
So for those people, the police, they're reasonably well off,
Yep.
and middle class, people like us,
Yep.
we're actually the zombies.
No, go
We're
on.
stalking them. Is that what you were saying? That when they look at the rest of the society around it, stalking them,
Yep.
or trying to deprive them of a place where they can lie, or a place where they can pitch a tent, or
Yep.
all of these sorts of things. So, for them,
Mhm.
I haven't thought about this before, but for them, using your image of this archetype,
Yep.
for them, the establishment within our society is in fact the walking dead, trying to destroy them of the possibility of living.
Yes, and actually when you think
So
about
it does play on both sides.
And actually what's really scary when you really study this particular subject on how we neglect the poor, actually a friend of mine spent some time in prison. I'll mention in this conversation, but he talked about his prison guy he was in prison with was a homeless man. Every year what he would do is he would commit a crime to get out of the cold.
Yeah, I had to go to prison to get a warm place for the winter.
And it's, what's scary is the neurosis of this is it takes about, was it $83,000 per year to keep a person in prison. If you go half the year, that's $40,000.
Well, actually, the much more realistic prison, or price, I looked into this a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In a maximum security prison, it's about $300,000 a year for each person.
300,000.
$300,000 in a maximum security prison. It's insane.
And some people just want a nice place to live, but are willing to spend $300,000, anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 to put someone in prison when we could have just bought them a cheap apartment somewhere.
Well, it depends on the ones that are there. Depends on what they have done and what the assessment is. But in the last 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
we have put a lot of people in maximum security prisons that could be dealt with in a far healthier way than that. So
Yes.
it's a curious phenomenon.
Yes. Okay.
So does that wrap it up for zombies?
I think that does, because I think that really gets to the point of, like I said, I think we discovered what's possibly the reason for why the zombie genre is so popular and continues to be popular after so many years.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, thank you very much for coming on my show, David Gold.
Nice to see you.